The first moment of real pressure arrived not in a courtroom but in a conference room whose glass walls reflected a skyline of cranes and the oldest remaining zinc roofs, and there, in a sudden reversal of the usual script, Amina found herself seated not as a defendant denying a theft, but as a partner in a plan that would stitch the neighborhood into a cooperative charter. Obina did not propose a gift but a framework. A tenant rights trust that would own the land, grant long leases at fair rates, and seat residents on its board, including Amina's small circle of trusted neighbors who had learned to count on each other more faithfully than any balance sheet. He spoke aloud a phrase that sounded almost sermon-like in its sincerity. "This is not charity that forgets you when the cameras leave. This is a framework that remembers you when the city forgets the name of the street." And Chinelo, who had smiled too readily and too often for the wrong reasons, stood at the edge of the room, listening as if a storm she did not control was about to break in, and in that listening, she heard the old tune of power slipping away and the slower, steadier rhythm of accountability asserting itself. The room's mood shifted from suspicion to cautious hope as the documents, scanned and stapled and then slid across the surface of the table like coins offered to a temple, began to reveal the truth. The lease would be transformed, not from a pulse of exploitation to a charity's lullaby, but into a living document that enforced community oversight, audits every quarter, and a fund that would restore any small business harmed by the previous development if a price spike threatened their doors. Midway through the meeting, a new wave rose when the blind boy's father, an unassuming man who lived in a rented room behind Mama Nkechi's kitchen, stood and spoke with a tremor in his voice that carried the weight of a city's unspoken fears and its quiet, hard-won pride. "We learn to read with the map of hunger in our mouths. We learn to tell time by the wage day that never came. If you give us a pen and a chair at the table, we will draw the future for our children, not wait for someone to draw it for us." The room absorbed his words as if he had placed a key into a lock that had stubbornly refused to turn. Obina's gaze searched the man's eyes and found not a debtor's plea, but a citizen's demand for a seat at the table, and something in the billionaire's posture shifted. The shoulders relaxed, a hint of apology drifted into his smile, and in that moment Amina knew the interval's tight plot had opened into something she could not have imagined. A power reversal in which wealth was not a hammer to hammer down a street, but a rope to lift a whole community out of fear. The conference room door opened and the city's auditors stepped in with questions and cameras flashing, and Obina paused to answer with a transparency that made the air feel different, as if the room itself had learned to breathe easier. The first tangible consequence arrived when the board's vote passed with a surprising unanimity. Tenants, neighbors, and market sellers would co-own, oversee, and benefit from the new trust. And the city agreed to pause any further demolition while the charter's mechanisms were tested in the open, hands-on way that only a real process could prove. 2 weeks later, the rain had learned a kinder rhythm, and the red earth glowed with a new coat of sun-warmed dust, as if the street itself exhaled after holding its breath for so long. And at the bus stop, the blind boy came tapping along with his cane, his head lifting when a distant horn sounded, as if the road itself could guide him now that a different kind of grid held the community together. Amina stood on the edge of the pavement, wiping her palms on her apron, and watched the wheels of Obina Holdings' public relations caravan roll past, a parade of glossy placards, and a rumor that the man who owned the silver-blue car with the rain-streaked window was not the cruel, distant figure the block had learned to fear, but a man who could be spoken to as a neighbor. And in that strange tension, a second truth pressed into the air. The wealth gap, once a quiet knife at the back of every good intention, was being named, measured, and finally confronted in a way that could either choke or feed a whole street. The boy reached Amina first and pressed his hand into hers, a warm, if uncertain, anchor. and he whispered something in a language she did not know, but the cadence was a map of home, not hunger. And when she offered him a small piece of boiled yam from a paper bag, he accepted with the trust of someone who believed a meal could be a treaty, a promise that the rain would not steal this moment away the way power sometimes did. Then came the first sign that the interval twist had not merely paused the old drama, but prepared a new stage. Obina, stepping from the car with a calm, measured stride, approached them, not as a benefactor in a glossy suit, but as a man who carried the weight of a city's memory and a ledger thick with questions, and his eyes, which had watched the feeding of the blind boy from the doorway weeks ago, now searched Amina's face for the same answer. Ere the street itself wanted to hear, will you be quiet and accept relief, or will you insist on a future where relief is a right rather than a rumor whispered at market stalls? He spoke first in a voice that was careful to be plain, not theatrical. Ms. Amina, the city is watching what we do with this space. The world believes in the story of charity. But I want the makers of this story to be the people who live here. And the words landed like rain clapping softly on tin roofs, inviting questions that had long lived in every cracked concrete corner of their lives. The crowd that gathered did not cheer as much as exhale, and a chant, soft at first, then louder, began to move like a slow river through the market, a chorus of mothers and market men saying, in effect, we want ownership of our own future, not a burden carried by a distant wealth that never speaks our language. Obina's next move would decide whether that river would drown a memory of debt or carry them toward a dawn where rent is a right and a street is a common home. The consequences landed with sound. Mr. Okoro's arrest was not cinematic in the heroic chase sense, but administrative and sharp, with ledgers and recorded calls and the slow, patient unspooling of corruption before a judge, and Chinelo was dismissed from her social work role when her ties to the developer were posted in the morning paper. The canteen's cooking pots, which had been sold in a panic, were bought back through a fund Obina established that was explicitly for small businesses displaced by development. And Mama Nkechi's cough, treated by a clinic the company agreed to fund, grew quieter as hot medicine moved through her chest. Amina's name, which had been a whisper on the street, became the name on a small plaque for a community kitchen that Obina helped renovate, and the blind boy, whose coat smelled of the soap Amina liked to buy at the market, kept coming to the canteen and took Amina's hand like a small, firm blessing. On the day the painters rolled orange over the old corrugated metal, the danfo horn sounded like a fanfare for people who had been told they would never see a change. Amina, who had once fed that blind child in the rain with nothing but pap and courage, watched the red earth of their plot stay in place under the sun like a stubborn promise. The new normal arrived gradually and with textures Amina could count. The generator hummed less because the company installed a proper connection, and the nights gained the low, safe sound of steady electricity. She opened a small catering stall with a painted sign and a loan that required no humiliating guarantees, and Kemi, whose skirt used to be too short for winter, now had a proper uniform and a neat lunchbox. Amina hired 2 women who had served plates with her for years, and they wore aprons that said Mama Nkechi Community Kitchen, and folded manioc into perfect shapes as a radio hummed nil. Wouse about a court case that had changed who counted as powerful. Obina's visits were rare and without cameras. Once he came and sat quietly in a corner while Amina cut yams, and he told her with a rough tenderness, "You taught me more about my city than any report." And she felt something settle. Her life had moved from a narrow room over a canteen into a wider street where choices had edges, and things repaired themselves not with charity, but with rightness. Kindness matters, and its ripple reaches into places you cannot see. A single plate, shared in the rain, found its way into the hands of someone who could change more than a life. Truth takes courage, and when a person chooses dignity over expedience, It forces systems to reckon with the cost of their comforts. Never forget that one act of mercy can rearrange the map of power and make a future where people are not priced out of home and hunger. If this story touched you, tell us what you would have done in Amina's place in the comments. And if you want more tales that walk the red earth and meet the people who live there, like, subscribe, share with a friend, and turn on notifications so the next story arrives warm and certain. Then, at a point when the walls of her life seemed to be tilting and the bulldozer engines hummed like a storm, the twist came like sunlight through the harmattan. Obinna Eze, the plain-shirted man who watched her feed a blind child by the bus stop, was not merely a sympathetic bystander, but the chairman of Obinna Holdings and the very billionaire whose company had bought the neighboring lots and whose signatures lay on the eviction notice. The revelation was not whispered in a closed room but announced in a corridor when an assistant called his name and the leather of his briefcase flashed his company crest, and Amina, standing in the crowd with a petition clutched in her hand, felt the world redraw itself around one truth. This man held the power to tear their street into a parking lot or to hold it in his palm like a fragile bird. Obinna's pause, the cool tilt of his head as he watched her, forced a new choice upon Amina. He could sign the papers that made her a beneficiary of corporate charity, a token on a glossy brochure, or he could use the authority in front of him to stitch the community back together. But his choice would cost someone, and Amina had to decide whether to accept rescue or demand justice. Darkness canyoned into the narrowest part of Amina's life, when promises showed their shallow undersides, and she discovered that the job offered by Chinelo was indeed a public relations role meant to show the world that Obinna Holdings cared about displaced people, while their actual apartments, the ones with running water and proper foundations, were being filed away under different company names for resale. "Sign this, and they leave you the title," Chinelo said in a voice like butter, sliding paperwork that smelled faintly of cigarette smoke and someone else's penmanship across the table, but at the bottom of the clause was language that turned title into temporary lease, and upu compensation, into a schedule of fees disguised as generosity. Amina looked at the paper and at Obinna's face, which had gone suddenly tired, and thought of Kemi's small, steady breathing upstairs. Instead of choosing a convenient path that would keep them fed for a while, she remembered the mornings she had fed the blind boy because it was right, and not because anyone watched, and so she stood and said, "I will not be someone's image while my neighbors sleep on the ground." Her refusal was not grand. It was the sound of a woman choosing truth over easy rescue, and in the silence that followed she felt everything she had given return to her as strength. The climax unfolded in public and with sharp, cinematic edges. Amina, petition in hand, and the mothers of the street behind her, marched to the Obinna Holdings office one morning when the sky was a flat, truthful gray, and there she laid out, in plain words and with pieces of paper and photographs she had begged and borrowed from neighbors, the web of bribery and false witnesses used to speed the demolitions. Cameras, some from true reporters, some from phones lifted like spears, caught the moment Obinna held the pages and read, his face moving through surprise to a sternness that took him years to perfect in boardrooms. "I saw a woman feed a child in the rain," he said in a tone that carried across the courtyard, "and I did not know then that my company had been part of the harm. That ends now." The chairman announced an immediate halt to the demolitions, called for an independent audit, and in front of everyone named Mr. Okoro and the list of those implicated. The developer's manager was led away to answer questions. Chinelo's smiling face drained of color as her connections were shown on paper, and the street felt for the first time in months like a place where justice could be laced on the table and weighed. The pattern broke again when, on a market morning thick with the smell of roasted peanuts and the breath of the harmattan, the plain-shirted man from the doorway reappeared at the canteen door and spoke to Amina with a voice like distant thunder made kind. He asked for directions not to the complex but to the old well at the end of the street, and when she answered he waited, watching her hands, and said quietly, "That boy at the bus stop. He remembers your face. Tell me his name." For the first time in weeks, Amina felt a thread of possibility that was not tied to envelopes or threats. The man said his name low, as if it were a thing that could be shared only in shadows. Obina, and Amina's chest tightened because the name matched the letters on the eviction notice and the voices at the mosque courtyard. He left a small card with an embossed logo that looked like a bird taking flight, and his driver called him out to a car that smelled of leather and rain, and as it slid away, the community's laughter dimmed into a hush. Why had the man who watched the boy returned, and what did his interest mean for those whose street might be paved over? A seed of kindness, the kind that had warmed Amina's hands and cooled Kemi's brow for years, sprouted into a moment that would not let itself be buried. On a day when the generator had died and Mama Nkechi had only one small bowl of pap left for the children who gathered after school, Amina broke the pap in half and fed it to the blind boy who arrived with a cane that tapped like a slow drum, his sightless face turned toward sounds as if his ears carried maps. She did not know whose son he was, only that his mouth needed warmth and that shame had no place on a plate. Her heart tightened when he smiled at the flavor like a man remembering summer rains, and she heard the soft intake of breath behind her. Obina, standing with a siki, opera rain streak on his sleeve, had been within earshot, and had watched her without drawing breath. He reached into his pocket and left a slip of paper with numbers and names and the words, "Come to the office, if you will." But his eyes, when he looked at Amina, held a quiet astonishment. She had fed a child, and without knowing it, had fed a question into a billionaire's conscience that would not be satisfied easily. Pressure closed in like a hand around a throat. The demolition date stamped on a poster read 3 days, and the landlord's final demand had arrived with a van to load the canteen's battered pots, and Mama Nkechi's cough had gotten worse, adding the urgent tally of hospital bills to the list of things that would not wait. "If we are gone by dawn, where will Kemi sleep?" Amina whispered to the flaking paint of their kitchen wall, and she imagined the answer in blunt, dangerous shapes. A mat in the mosque courtyard, a neighbor's spare bed, the kind of cold night that taught children early how to knot their hunger into silence. The number on the paper Obina had left became a timer on her hope. When Chinelo told her gently, "I can get you work overseeing the canteen on the new site. It's not charity, it's stability." The offer felt like a rope thrown by someone who had also tied hands behind people's backs, and Amina had to choose fast. Do she accept a role that might be a gilded cage, or stand with dignity and possibly lose everything by morning? The first trial was legal letters and bulldozers. The second was humiliation in bright fluorescent light. When a municipal inspector, smelling of cologne and authority, declared that Mama Nkechi's license had some irregularities, the canteen's manager pulled Amina aside and said, "We need a scape. People will look for someone." As if hunger could be folded into a neat apology. Amina watched the inspector's pen move like a guillotine and felt poverty sharpening its blade against the smiles of the women who served plates. A pattern formed. Men in clean shoes with clipped hair arrived under the guise of help. Charity plates, appeals to modernity. And Amina, whose palms had learned to be generous, accepted a small envelope of cash from a woman named Chinelo, who called herself a social worker and said, "Let me help you find work," before asking for a list of the canteen's customers and the exact dates of the rent payments. Amina tucked the envelope into her apron because there were mouths and a baby cough and the rain, but the envelope was a seed with teeth, and she did not know which fruit would bite her back when it grew. What had Chinelo really brought, and why did the paperwork smell of oil and a different city? When the second pattern interrupted itself, it did so with courtroom paper and a wolf who smiled like a neighbor. Chinelo began to come by every morning with a thermos of hot tea and a notebook, listening as Amina spoke of the children in the alleyways and the church that lent mats to the homeless on Mondays, but the smile grew colder when the company lawyer arrived bearing a lease transfer and an offer that claimed to improve livelihoods if they signed away the small plot where the canteen stood. "Think of your daughter's future," Chinelo murmured one afternoon, pressing the rough paper to Amina's palm as if she were offering a toy. And Amina felt. Let something close to trust loosen in her ribs. That night, a neighbor whispered that Chinelo had been seen speaking to Mr. Okoro, the developer's manager, at the mosque courtyard during Friday prayers, while the danfo horns blew like distant alarms, and Amina's kindness, fed in the bus stop, given to a blind boy, sat like a coin in her mouth. Could one small act of mercy ripple toward ruin if it fell into the wrong hands? Fear folded into a new trial as accusations came from where she least expected. A cash discrepancy in Mama Nkechi's account materialized like a conjured ghost, and someone else's fingerprints, meticulous, set in a print that matched the office ledger, led to Amina being called over the canteen speakers and accused of taking money she did not have, while the rain clattered like a jury outside. Amina's throat closed. Her hands, which had only ever mixed batter and comforted scrapes, shook as she tried to explain that she had no idea, that her life was counted in plates and not in ledgers, but the manager's eyes were not searching for truth, only for an explanation that would reduce their obligations when the bulldozers came. The wolf in sheep's clothing had given her tea and the offer of a job across the road in the shiny office that would replace their street. And then Chinelo's name had been on the list the developer's offices produced as a witness to theft. Amina saw the pattern and felt the teeth close. What would she do when the law believed the ledger instead of the woman whose hands smelled of cassava? Rain had just washed the red earth into a darker, glistening brown when Amina knelt at the bus stop, her hands trembling with the heat of the steaming pap, as she guided a spoon to the mouth of a small blind boy who smelled of soap and diesel. If she was seen by the wrong person feeding him, Mom and Nkechi would lose another mouthful of profit, and the landlord would have one more reason to throw them all into the street, and the thin line between dignity and disaster would snap. Who was this small, pale child that everyone pretended not to see? And why did the man in the plain shirt with the tired eyes and the sleeve embroidery she couldn't read watch them so intently from the shaded doorway? The sound of a danfo horn split the rain, and the stranger moved away, his car, too wide, too quiet, sliding down the lane like a promise that could be kept or broken. Amina did not know that a billionaire had just seen a waitress feeding his blind son, and the sight lodged in his chest like a question. But a driver's shout yanked her back as trouble stalked the yard. What would happen if the right pocket noticed what the wrong hand had done? Amina's ordinary world was a narrow room above Mama Nkechi's canteen, where the generator hummed at night, and the harmattan sometimes breathed grit into the curtains, and every morning she walked the red-stained alley to serve plates of beans and fried plantain to men who paid with wet coins and sharp words, while her daughter Kemi slept curled around a patched blanket under the window where light came in thin and hopeful. She believed in small economies of care, sharing the extra akara with a hungry neighbor, smoothing Kemi's hair before school, telling herself that shame would not teach her daughter how to stand, and she had one unbreakable promise. Whatever the price of tomorrow, Kemi would not know hunger the way Amina had. Her heart wore a pat. Heinz learned from generations of women who balanced rent on their backs like a basket and walked without complaining. And when the canteen bell rang, she moved through the market bustle like one of those women, hands quick, face calm, until the day a stranger's stare cut through her rhythm and everything tilted. The event that shattered the small, routine order arrived like a stiff wind from the river. Mama Nkechi, face creased from sleepless ledgers and a cough that rattled when the generator cut, announced that a man from Obina Holdings had bought the property next door and would be developing a modern complex that required clearing the lots immediately. The landlord handed down an eviction notice with a polite nod and a folding chair of indifference, and Mama Nkechi, with the legal envelope folded into her palm, sold the canteen's deep fryer to a dealer who counted the cash and didn't look at anyone. Amina's pulse went cold. 3 months' rent, the only savings she kept in a tin under her mattress, vanished into someone else's ledger, and one of the regulars, Nwati, who smiled like a mango seller in the dry season, said in a voice too low for the din that these developments never came with kindness for people like them. That night, as rain stitched the corrugated roofs with silver, Amina wondered aloud, "Who is Obina, and why must our red earth be traded away?" And the thought stuck like a thorn in her throat. Back on the street, the old rhythm returned with a new tempo. The generator hummed less loudly because the trust funded a reliable electricity line. The market's chatter carried the faint scent of fresh paint on the walls that would soon bear the sign, Community Kitchen Tenant Rights Center. And Mama Nkechi, whose cough had become a stubborn cousin of hope, whispered to Amina with a tremulous pride, "You fed a child in the rain, and you fed a future in the daylight." And Amina nodded, feeling the weight of years lift enough to let a small breath of triumph pass through her chest. The blind boy, now a fixture in the kitchen's doorway, his cane tapping out a steady rhythm while he listened to stories of a city that could change, took Amina's hand again and pressed it with a little more strength, as if to say thank you for believing in him, even when eyes could not see all the waiting. Obina's car no longer lurked at the curb as a distant threat, but returned sometimes, not with cameras or speeches, but with quiet conversations in which he asked a neighbor or two to help test the trust's boundaries, and his presence did not overshadow the work of the street, but emphasized it, turning the wealth gap into a visible line that the community could redraw with their own pencils. The interval marks had done more than reveal a hidden billionaire who could buy time and buy back futures. They had forced a moral economy to wake up and act, and the new normal began to feel like a long, bright corridor that connected the alley where Amina stood with a future where doors opened without the need to beg for mercy. The final image of this section settled on the blind boy's face when he watched the first banner go up, not a headline about damage control, but the true banner of a lived promise, a home for the meals that fed 6 mouths, a board that listened to the market's whispers, a street that could thrive without anyone needing to pretend the red earth was not real and the people who loved it were not its true wealth. A newsline remained, though, tucked behind the new gleam of a clean sidewalk and a cooperative ledger. Somewhere beyond the glass towers and the loud prayers of progress, a stubborn thread of resistance, a single stubborn thread that could still unravel or redeem a future depending on who chose to hold it. And as the rain began again, soft enough to glaze the zinc roofs without washing away the day's hard-won truth, Amina turned to Kemi, her daughter's eyes bright with the possibility of studying in a classroom that had once seemed only a rumor in the market, and she whispered, "We did not just save a street, we began to save our own names," then added, almost as a quiet afterthought to the watching world, "If I could, I would do it all again, and I would do it again tomorrow because kindness is a form of courage that money cannot counterfeit, and justice, once invited in, does not leave." The next moment paused on the edge of possibility, where a city of doors could either close again or stay open, and the intervals twist, hung in the air like a new kind of rain, the kind that asks for nothing but a chance to fall, drip, and make everything that followed true. If this story touched you, tell us what you would have done in Amina's place in the comments, and if you want more tales that walk the red earth and meet the people who live there, like, subscribe, share with a friend, and turn on notifications so the next story arrives warm and certain. The last 2 sentences hold steady. Obina's presence is now a pledge, not a price. The street's stubborn red earth remains a testament to choice, and the audience's breath waits for what comes next as the camera pulls back from the crowd and finds the quiet kitchen where a pot steams in a chill. Dee sleeps, ready for the next act to begin.